Um, Welcome everyone. I'm Chris Lindgren with Mass Bio. Just a couple of housekeeping and then I'll turn it over to our moderator. I want to make sure that people please frequent massbio.org. We just updated our website. So please frequent it often, look at the events and the news. Keep your profile updated and your preferences so we are sending you information that's relevant to you. For today's forum, I'd like you to please use the Q&A function for questions because that's where our moderator will be looking for the questions. I'll keep an eye on the chat in case someone is trying to reach out to us that way, but the questions in the Q&A, please. Our moderator today is Craig Lipset. He's former head of innovation at Pfizer, and he's advisor and founder of Clinical Innovation Partners. Craig, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to get to share with you today. So today we're going to be talking about, obviously, the impact of the pandemic on clinical trials that we're all trying to keep moving forward today. The clinical research community has been rising up and stepping forward in so many ways, whether that is to maintain existing studies and ensure that patients can continue to participate where it is key for them to have access to those investigational medicines. We'll talk about some of these trial continuity strategies. We'll talk about some of the delays that are happening right now and some of the strategies that organizations can use to take advantage of the time and make sure that their studies are ready to go. And then we'll also lean in a bit about the future. And as we look on the other side of the curve, what will clinical research look like in 2021 and beyond? How do we make sure the things that are making an impact for us today, the right things stick and become a part of that new normal? Joining me for this conversation are three friends, and I'm very excited to get to share the screen with them. I'll let them introduce themselves, but as you do that, I'd like you to just share not only who you are and your day job, but also the perspective that you're going to be bringing to this conversation in terms of the impact of the pandemic and the work that you've been driving. Lori, would you like to get us started?
Sure. Lori Halloran, Halloran Consulting Group. We work as on-demand development teams with about 150 companies. So we have a particular interest in this topic because we need to be able to react to how studies are being done or not done so that we can provide the best advice to our clients on keeping things moving. I also have a particular interest in thinking about how we could make our lives better and more efficient with technology that we might want to get our heads around now and take it to the future.
Thank you, Lori. Cheryl.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Small. I'm Vice President of Clinical Operations at Alnylam. I've been here for about a year now. Alnylam is a small biotech. What is top of my mind currently is really how to manage through the current crisis and keep our ongoing clinical trials moving forward and keeping the momentum of our clinical trials and really ultimately giving our patients peace of mind that these trials are continuing and that innovation isn't stopping.
It's a great point, and we will definitely come back to that, Cheryl, in terms of in addition to all of the other continuity strategies, how do we make sure that we're communicating effectively with the participants themselves? And Ed, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. Ed Seguin, I'm the CEO of Clinical Inc. Clinical Inc. is a technology provider. We pioneered the concept of eSource in sites and for patients. So we have direct data capture solutions for sites that have been used in a lot of infectious disease studies, Ebola, tuberculosis, RSV, influenza, as well as a variety of others. And I'll be talking about how this has impacted technology vendors' responsiveness to, at least from our perspective, the delays, the existing patients. For perspective, we've got about 135 active studies right now going on in 50 countries at about 6,500 sites. So we got a different range of kind of perspectives as this pandemic has kind of rolled through different areas of the country, and we're pretty data oriented. So we've got a lot of what we call early indicators that we've been looking at things and trying to respond to that. So I'll bring that kind of how do you vendor implementation perspective and how you work with clinical ops teams.
Perfect. So we have some very nice diverse perspectives from either deep within a ClinOps organization, working laterally across several different young biotech companies, and deep within the technology and provider side. So let's jump in, and for the audience, please settle in with your coffee, but make sure you're using the Q&A function on the screen. You'll find it on the bottom, and drop some questions even as we're going. We'll try to make sure we incorporate those into the conversation. So let's get started. The first topic on my mind is around trial continuity. Obviously, we all had many studies that were active and underway before this pandemic hit. We have patients who need to maintain their participation. In many cases, they're relying on that investigational product as a core part of their care and therapy. Maintaining drug supply, monitoring and safety, collecting endpoint data. Lori, what are the top 2 or 3 things that are keeping you and the clients you're working with awake right now in terms of key strategies to address around trial continuity right now?
I mean, we're a month into this now, so it's been the top of mind that the patients can't or don't want to or are afraid to get to research sites. And it's less critical if it's not a life-threatening disease. It's much more critical if it is. So trying to find workarounds, trying to manage the changes to protocols in real time so that they can find workarounds are the top things that our clinical folks are seeing.
So, so that the impact of those changes on the protocol, whether that means, in terms of the endpoint, the monitoring plans, and so on.
How long can you let them go without, or have them skip a visit, or how can you get the visit, the most critical safety and efficacy procedures done without having them leave their house or come to the practice? And it's vastly different if the practice is not in an academic medical center. If it's a standalone, it's nowhere near as regimented, but a lot of those practices have actually laid off their workers. So that's another whole level of issue. So it's, it's a really across the board in that kind of situation. And then a lot of the companies themselves are thinking about how to, in real time, manage the narrative and the risk, because down the road, we're going to have to look back and have justification for what we did in order to satisfy the regulatory authorities. So it's a lot of changing and shifting and documenting all at the same time.
Interesting point. I want to make sure we come back to around that difference in the sites. I think that'll be an interesting point to come back to. Cheryl, what is other than Tiger King, what else is keeping you awake at night right now? What's front on your mind right now?
There's certainly plenty. The site access, as Lori brought up, is definitely was that leading indicator. We started to see that about 6 weeks ago in Asia, and then the wave continued over to the Western world. And we started with the seeing the site access restricted to the monitors, and now certainly to the patients, either through their own self deferral of visits or travel restrictions or sites actually shutting down. So what kept us up, certainly in the early days, and is currently keeping us up, is how do we manage through that? And we're in a rare disease space, and how do you continue those patients in the clinical trial? And importantly, patients who are currently receiving study medications that they rely on. How do we get those study medications to those patients who can't come into the site as they traditionally would? How do you get that to the study patients reliably and safely? And how do you make sure that they're safeguarded through this entire challenge? So that's a big piece that's on my mind. another big piece on the mind is then beyond keeping the patient safe and keeping them on study medications is how do you keep those trials that are currently in flight moving, right? And how do you protect the integrity of the trial? And how do you protect what are the right things to protect in that trial and in this kind of environment? Are there things that are nice to haves? How do you distinguish between the nice to haves and the must haves in terms of protecting your primary efficacy endpoint and those pieces? So those are the things that we've been thinking about and then taking action against.
Cheryl, in your portfolio, are these small molecules? Is this an infusion-based issue? And how are you managing getting that supply chain today into the patient's hands?
Right. So it is small molecule. We do have infusion, and we also have sub-Q injection. So we have started doing, we were lucky in the sense that we had already a vast amount of experience with home care delivery in many of our trials. So we were able to very quickly industrialize that across the trials and use our past experience there. There's definitely a supply issue of home care staff around the world, and then access to it around the world. We have been able to implement home infusions or walking ourselves towards home care infusions. And also we're looking at definitely in terms of the sub-Q injections, how we can do that in the house, either through a health care professional. And we're also looking towards innovative things like bringing more self-administration where it makes sense and where it makes sense for a patient population, and how you would do that in what we do. Right.
I'm sure it helped that there was some familiarity with home health care, that this wasn't entirely new, dropping entirely new partner models in is certainly a big challenge for many organizations today. Ed, what's keeping you up at night on this? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Lori.
Well, a lot of these changes are being looked at with a lot of open minds by ethics committees and IRBs. So, it's incumbent on the sponsor to think through what they could make more efficient. And then as long as it's not compromising safety, there's an opportunity to do that.
Correct.
Well, along those lines, I think the community here is fortunate in that when this pandemic hit, we didn't have to go back to the research labs and cook up a solution. In many cases, the solutions were available. In many cases, they're available on the market today. It was just a matter of familiarity and adoption. And Ed, maybe some of that actually links into some of your work today. What are the things that are keeping you awake right now on this during this pandemic?
Right. So we routinely watch literally every single week, and we segregate the data that are used across our systems. So what we've seen is starting from, call it mid-January to mid-February, there was a really slow leak on existing patient activity and not really a big effect in new patient enrollment. Around about mid-February, new patient enrollment dropped off the cliff, like 70% over a period of 3 weeks into like the second week of March. It went down like 70% from its peak for new patients. Existing patient activity has kind of slowly leaked to about 80% of its normal level. So we're still seeing across all 130 studies. Now there's certain studies that have bigger disparities that kind of depend on those trial dynamics. But across the portfolio, whether it's CNS or GI or immunology, we're seeing about 75 to 80% in terms of the existing patients. And when we look at data about Epro, patients are actually staying pretty compliant. I don't know if that has to do with they're at home, and so they can, it's easier to see the things that they're supposed to do. So when we are talking with customers and CROs, we're like, your patients are still going to the visit, so they're generating data. There's a different question about that Cheryl mentioned, getting monitors to sites. That's a massive problem, and different sources show that. One of the benefits of our platform, however, is when you're capturing the data electronically, you don't send monitors there. We're well equipped to do that. When we had our Ebola experience, you were monitoring the Ebola studies from South Africa and London, and you weren't even going there. So CROs who have some of that experience about how to do real remote monitoring of source documents, not just a risk-based monitoring assessment of data, tend to do well. We've been getting questions about, could you switch Epro studies from a provision device to a BYOD model? Because you've got, with BYOD, you've got logistics getting into countries, or excuse me, with the devices, you've got logistics getting in there, and with commercial air travel down, you can't really get a lot of things. So that's one of the things we did, was buy up as much inventory as we could to supply ourselves all the way through 2020, because we didn't want to get hit with supply chain issues when things come on. And then the final thing that that is actually probably the most pressing is new study starts. We're signing a lot of new programs, but those new studies are not starting, and the customers are worried, like, when are we going to start? So what we've been saying is, go ahead and finalize your protocol. That's something you can control now. That's something you can work on now. And it allows the vendors to build the studies according to that, because what we fear is that there's going to be this wave of, okay, now let's go. There's this pent up backlog, and there's going to be this, everyone's going to get hammered from trying to get things up. That's when you create mistakes. That's when you get screw ups. And we're trying to get that kind of pressure release valve, get that work done during a period of relative calm for that group, not for the industry, so that when this frees up, you're ready to go in a more normalized fashion. And that may incorporate doing things like planning for virtual visits, planning for remote monitoring. But if you're doing that planning now for upcoming studies, you're not going to have a second wave of disruption and mess. And that's something that you can control right now.
And I want to come back to that topic around planning for the backlog. But for studies that folks have going on today, what are are people able to change endpoints on the fly? Can they simply call you up and say, "Hi Ed, my patients can't get to the clinic, so can you drop your tools into my existing studies right now and help me out?" How much intervention is really feasible at this stage if this wasn't baked into the development plan?
So that's where there's a lot of, like, that's panic thinking. And so if you can adjust the configuration of the platform to, add and remove, measurements and activities or even visits, that's one thing, but don't do that lightly, because the implementation time, what we've been saying is that the implementation time for some of these things may be longer than the actual event itself, so to speak. And so then you're going to have some different data. We can, in fact, we just launched a COVID study that we did the full build in 2 weeks. So we do have the flexibility of doing the platform. But what we've always cautioned is, just because you can be flexible doesn't mean you need to have a yo-yo-like reaction, like, oh my gosh, I got to do something right now because I feel if I'm doing something, I'm obviously, doing something important. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes just a steady write it out. And I don't mean this to sound like accusatory or anything. Oftentimes, even in the course of many studies, you'll go through dips and valleys on recruitment, and you just kind of weather those, whether it's like, we always see this around the holidays. 3 weeks around the holidays, Christmas, it shuts down. We're nowhere near that level. Even like in the United States, Thanksgiving, the 2 weeks around that, it's right about here. August is typically a month that's, from where we are, it's about 20% more, 25% more than where we are now just for August. So there's normal inflections. This just heightens it by bigger anxieties of knowing what's the uncertainty of coming out of this. So we're really saying, don't overreact. But
real quick follow-up for the audience, BYOD stands for?
bring your own device, so allowing patients to use their own phone as opposed to provision phones. And that we have been doing. We've been able to, it's the same platform on a provision phone. We just flip and say, okay, give them their own phone, or let them use it on their own phone. That's an easy switch for us.
Thanks, Ed. Lori, what about endpoints in the studies that you're involved in right now? Are people able to continue to capture the endpoint data for their studies, whether efficacy and safety in this environment, or is some of that going to end up with significant gaps in data today?
I don't know that we're going to know that until we look back at it. I think people are right now trying to do the best they can. There's a lot of interest and discussion around telemedicine. We're actually, not to give a plug, but we're having a town hall on that on Friday, where we have several companies that are already doing telemedicine who will weigh in on the feasibility of switching, midstream. But I don't know that we're gonna, we're not gonna have any conclusions until we look back on some kind of a retroactive study. The studies that we have going on right now, people are doing like I said, they're doing the best they can. If there's an opportunity to collect blood in a way that's different, that's potentially an endpoint. They'll send out kits to do home collection with finger sticks. They'll see if they can redirect people to a local lab that isn't necessarily, you don't have the lab normals, but let's not worry about right now. One of the conversations I had yesterday was about the 6-minute walk test. And this goes towards the future a little bit. For years, we've been flying people in to do the six-minute walk test in front of somebody who was trained to observe it. Does it have to be in the same place? Do they have to go hundreds or thousands of miles so that they can have that done? Or could they do it at home with somebody watching on video? Like, that's some of the stuff that we've imposed on ourselves that we've now decided to start thinking creatively so that we can do the endpoints and get around it, but not necessarily compromise the data.
6-minute walk test is a great example. The idea that we have to fly somebody so we can watch them do a 20-meter lap back and forth because the endpoint is so fragile. We're afraid that, if they glance away, if they don't turn after every 20 meters, that we won't be able to draw inferences, when today, whether it's watching them do it on video or building into your study plans to digitize that endpoint, but one can't really drop that in on day 0 of a pandemic and expect a new endpoint to be ready on the fly. Right. You set us up actually for some a question on my mind about sites and monitoring earlier. It's interesting that your comment about the difference between academic sites or sites that are attached to a larger healthcare operation versus freestanding, that there may be some difference in terms of their ability to support trials today. I think that probably mirrors a lot of healthcare right now. Primary care practices have been furloughing employees and because of the closed doors right now. How are you managing through that, and what are best practices for monitoring looking like in this environment? Are people trying to get into the clinic with iPhones and FaceTime to show source documents to monitors, or are people taking down some of their monitoring expectations?
Well, remember, the data is still going to be there at the end. It's not like they're going to take it out back and burn it. So monitoring is really the schedule for monitoring is something we impose on ourselves. A lot of health centers have relaxed the access to electronic health records. I hope that's something that's a harbinger of future activities, so that they don't have to have monitors there. The people who are a little bit forward thinking, who have the dashboards so that they can do some risk-based assessments from afar, will probably not be impacted in any meaningful way, because the source document verification becomes less critical when you can see whether or not the data is showing elevated risk. So you're really zeroing in on what's the highest priority from a risk perspective. But the EHR remote access is being actually managed pretty creatively, from people who are screenshotting various documents that are in place, to some companies that are really forward thinking, who already set up eSource, and it's actually simultaneously happening activity with data exchange.
Hard to drop that in after the fact, but certainly for those that had those connections in place or remote access for monitors, they they're probably well positioned right now. Cheryl, how are you seeing receptivity to alternative monitoring strategies within the organization?
Well, it's one of the silver linings I see right coming out of COVID-19 is it's really accelerated some of that dialogue, even within our team internally at Alnylam. We're having conversations that just a couple of months ago we weren't necessarily ready to have. So in terms of bringing in risk-based monitoring, true remote source document verification, even use of complete virtual visits. So it's accelerated, I think, that dialogue and really removed some of the barriers to the conversation. And I think that's one of the things over the summer we're going to take and reflect of some of these new techniques that we are rapidly implementing now. What is it that we're going to keep going forward, be it virtual visits, be it we're trying to implement telemedicine in some of our trials, and we're certainly pushing towards that true remote source document verification. So those are things that have been around for quite some time, and now it's I think those that can actually sort of leapfrog and really industrialize that across their practice, I think are going to be in good shape and come out of this, I think, very differently. Right.
Cheryl, I think that's an important point. I want to make sure we come back to that in a few minutes about how people can use this as a window for sustaining innovation, not just a transient, stressful period of time, but to try to find something to pull forward that's positive. But for right now, most of the industry is citing pauses in enrollment, pauses in new study starts. How are you using this time well? Are you able to build registries or backlogs of patients? Are you doing study startup to a certain extent, maybe up through SIV? Are you finding some geographies where you can do more than elsewhere? For the studies or activities that feel like they're delayed right now, how are you best using this time?
Correct. Yeah. So how are we using that gift of time, right? That we've I think I've heard you say, Craig. We haven't formally paused any studies, again, being in rare disease and also being across 35 to 50 different countries. The pandemic is playing out differently and at a different pace in those different countries. So we're trying to be extremely flexible in how we operate. We are seeing places such as in Asia start to come back online. So what we're doing for those studies that are in that sensitive period of startup mode, right, where we're enrolling a few patients, but we don't have a critical mass of sites up and running. Those sites, we're still working to get a lot of the activities, the startup activities done at the investigative sites. And my goal on a couple of our studies is actually to get to the end of this and not have contracts being what's holding up study activation for the first time, I think, in history. It might actually be something else. So what we are seeing is there's certain back office activities that are still ongoing. Some sites are completely shut down, but other sites, there's certain services that are still ongoing. So we're really working, partnering closely with our CROs on a site-by-site basis and progressing where we can. And importantly, having sites line those patients up for when they have the green light to go and when the coast is clear post-COVID-19, and really having those patients lined up. Again, we're in rare disease, as many companies are, and patients are truly, counting on these studies for themselves, but also, for giving back to their community going forward, right?
Quick follow-up. Do you still do investigator meetings at Alnylam, and do you think that those will still happen in the future?
That's another nut that I think has been cracked in terms of the virtual world. So we had certainly, face-to-face investigator meetings planned during this time, and we've quickly been able to pivot to and demystify what a virtual investigator meeting would look like, and attendance may actually go up.
Maybe.
Think about it. None of us did a Zoom before a month ago where we were perfectly comfortable, right?
And now we're all masters with virtual backgrounds and.
Yeah, and what's I think very good to see is certainly the regulators are taking a very pragmatic approach globally, right? I think what we have certainly seen is very good common sense guidance coming down, and that combined, certainly our internal team, a group of fantastic individuals who are very creative and are figuring this stuff out and really building this as we go.
Speaking of regulators, Lori, inspections are still happening?
I have not heard about inspections, at least in the clients in the context that we've had, where they've been on site.
Others hearing anything about regulatory inspections?
We have actually. We've responded to, in the last 2 weeks, 3 requests, 1 in Canada and 2 in, of all places, Japan. So they're going on site. So there is some of that activity still, and getting people supportive or prepared for that in this kind of environment is a little bit different, but yeah, there's still some, and that goes to, like, this is a very regionally affected kind of approach.
I've heard about U.S. Regulators with remote inspections, and that still places quite a bit of stress and work on the sponsor, the CRO, on the site during this time in terms of having access to what they need remote to support that.
We're actually, we're planning for remote inspection, and we're taking a couple of practice runs at it, just because, again, it's a very different environment and possibly capability, and making sure that IT infrastructure works, and things like these kind of virtual meetings work during an inspection timeframe, and having back rooms virtually, and all of those things. So yeah.
Ed, gift of time right now with teams that have delays right now. How are you advising partners and others to use this gift of time for the studies that are delayed? How can they make sure that when sites and studies can get back online fully, we're not going backward with protocol revisions and other delays at that point?
Yeah, so I'm a very pragmatic operations focused guy. So one of the things that we're saying is do your data cleaning now. There's no need to wait for it. One of the kind of perverse anomalies is, even if you can collect data in real time, the pharma companies and CROs are not actually geared up to be reviewing it remotely and cleaning it unless they're doing it at specific times, like right before data lock. And so there's no need for that. Get some of those data questions answered by looking at your initial data sets, getting them clarified, asking for reports at that time rather than late at crunch time. So that's a pretty easy thing that could be done right now in this time frame. In addition to what I said earlier about getting the protocol finalized, I think going to one of the questions about, or one of the comments about considering options for incorporating new approaches into your existing trial, this is an ideal environment for the conversations to be happening internally, because I make a separation between regulators and regulatory people in pharma. Now, I'm not throwing stones at regulatory people, but I've found that the creativity of regulatory people to come up with all the reasons why you shouldn't do something new far exceeds the actual commentary by the regulators in their indication of being open and accepting of new things, versus everything that you could possibly imagine that someone might say or do. And this creates a perfect environment to say, okay, is that really real? So have some of those conversations, and I think people's mindset are open. We have to do something different, and so that gives an opening to have those conversations. Again, if you're in regulatory, I'm not saying that you're a bad person, but I am saying that that's part of
Ed, the chat's lighting up. All the regulatory people on the line. Oh,
yes.
boy.
Our number of attendees just dropped by 12.
Not great. Look, I mean, we all know there are real guardrails in which we have to operate, and there are self-imposed guardrails,
right,
that we create either through culture or our own otherwise within our organizations. Lori, how else are you seeing or advising your partners around using this window right now, whether it's around thinking about recruitment in existing studies when that can pick back up, or thinking about the other studies that were in the pipeline that are getting delayed right now? How should people be using this gift of time?
Well, I mean, I've got too many answers for words. I mean, Cheryl, you're spot on with get the sites ready to go. Do everything up to and including an SIV to get the sites completely ready. It's not ethical to hold off on subjects you already have in the queue to get them, you can't tell them to hold off on some kind of a treatment unless it's part of the protocol. So you can't, that's the one thing you can't do. You can't reserve the subjects, but you can do everything else. There are people coming out of the woodwork who are having virtual SIVs and virtual investigator meetings. People are getting creative and doing, kind of specials for their technology. One of the things that we're also doing is we're going back and suggesting that people look at their protocols, because a lot of early stage biotechs put everything but the kitchen sink into their protocol because someday they might want something from the data. And if you're looking at the protocol and you're saying, no, we don't need this, we don't need this, we don't need this, it's patient burden, it's site burden, it's cost, and it's complexity that you don't need. So Ed, right to your point, this is a way to look at something and really look at what do we absolutely need, and then take that practice going forward, because you would make so much more sense to do that in all your trials, if you possibly can, to eliminate the unnecessary or the nice.
Like this is a special focus for efficiency because of this.
Yes. Oh, I mean, I see such incredible possibilities from this. That's the thing that keeps me awake at night is how do we capture that?
Lori, we have a question from your old friend Tony Carita, who is building on the topic around recruitment that was mentioned earlier. Given that there's normal inflections around study enrollment, especially in Europe in late summer, do we think that with people less inclined to travel in the summertime, people may be staying more local? Could that actually create a positive impact on recruitment if things start to open up during the summertime?
Well, it depends on if they get the refund on what they've already booked, but the airlines are being pretty helpful. So, I actually think that people are going to stay a whole lot closer to home, and that's basically from the experience of me and my friends. So there's a lot of people that aren't planning any massive trips, so it's entirely possible. But I don't know that we're going to necessarily be back to 100% normal by August. So if you listen to the epidemiologists, this is going to be longer than that.
Certainly not evenly distributed. That's for sure. We talked a little bit about these delays right now. What's the impact we should worry about or can intervene when it relates to either CROs or investigator sites? I imagine some CROs are particularly busy right now with perhaps billable activity. Maybe others are struggling a bit during this time, but even more so are investigator sites. And you mentioned, Lori, earlier, the difference between those that may be attached to a larger health setting or maybe freestanding. When we get to the other side, whenever that may happen, and this backlog of studies starts to go live, will the sites be there, or are some of them just going to struggle with the lack of new studies and new patients coming in that they just can't sustain in this window?
If I were giving advice to sites, I would say, think about how you're going to have surge capacity. Think about how you could potentially bring on some sub-investigators who might not even be in your own organization, but how you could, kind of cast a cooperative net so that you're not centralizing everything. Because that's possible, but it's going to take some time, and you should probably think about how to get them up to speed. That would be one of my ideas.
That's one of the areas that is keeping us up at night is what is going to happen to the investigative sites that we currently have, and which ones are going to survive COVID-19. This is putting a terrible toll on all of the investigative sites. And how do we help them, right? How do we help them through this time, and how do we help them prepare coming back? And then how do we prepare ourselves, as Lori suggested, for that surge? And the idea of bringing on additional sub-investigators, I think, is a really good one. In addition, we're looking at bringing on additional sites potentially, and getting those lined up, or at least identified now, some backup sites in case the sites that we have just either get burned out, aren't going to come back online for an extended period of time, or will look very different when they do come back online.
On that site note, I mean, everyone always talks about how they're worried about sites. One of the things that is the biggest worried about sites is getting paid.
Right.
If they don't get paid until they've been monitored,
right,
you've essentially predictated the outcome.
yeah.
And so reconsidering how you're going to, for pharma companies and CROs, pay the sites for the, like I said, 80% of the work that's going on right now that can't really be as effectively monitored. Yeah. Are you really going to be that at risk for quality data if you go ahead and pay on looser restrictions? That's something that you can decide right now.
That's really
and
good.
Then have some kind of planning for how do you address that after the fact. That's something that would really help the sites right now. That's one of the things we're looking at. How can we implement different payment triggers to drive data into the CROs? But ultimately, the decision about payment is a sponsor and a CRO decision. I think one of the other things that to do right now, is it's kind of alluded to, is start planning on the approach and having the conversations about change orders. This dip in new patients, inevitably, I'm going to offend another group, but CROs are going to be like, hey, this is a big bucket of change orders, because this means duration delays, other activities, and planning for how to minimize that, or at least have conversations about changing the dollars that are being used now versus what might be needed later. Those are things that can be very intentional plans, or at least have conversations about what that is with the CROs and with the technology providers. I'm kind of being inspired, weirdly enough, by auto insurers who are, essentially refunding some of their premiums for the fact that miles aren't being driven. We're going to be extending automatically the duration for all of our active studies on the licensing fees, just to account for the fact that we know this is going to be a dip. And so we're just basically auto tacking on months at the end of the study to account for the fact that what you didn't enroll now is going to have to be enrolled at some point. And yeah, maybe you can surge it, but how many times do you already have conversations about trying to surge enrollment and you really don't see it? So let's be real about that. Is going to be an extension. We're going to try and do our part by tacking that on without change orders on licensing for a period of time.
I would add another bit. If you're going to be rigid about making the monitors go to site visits, you're naive if you think that they're not going to be inundated as well. Very few CROs have 100% assignments. So if this is building up, those monitors are going to be, the expectations on those monitors is going to be not realistic. So if you can do some remote monitoring and call that a visit, then that's something you don't have to try to do later.
Right.
And you can have a televisit with the site and ask the same exact questions. Those are things that you can employ those CROs and the monitors to do the work that they should have been doing and not delay the end, and also be more likely to get somebody who's got a whole lot more time on their hands. That being said, CROs are not known for their vast amounts of flexibility. So that's going to have to be a really upfront conversation.
And speaking
I had
of vast amounts of flexibility, at least one viewer has commented on the willingness of sites to help cover the cost of PPE, of personal protective equipment, at the investigator site right now, which we know is, in many cases, has surge pricing attached to it for those institutions to be able to access. So it's probably also a call for sponsors to demonstrate flexibility in helping to keep those sites whole around those additional costs. Let me pivot a bit about that. Let me pivot a bit towards what one of the other questions online asked, and please keep those questions coming for those who are participating with us today. So the future should look different. If it doesn't look different for this community on the other side of the curve, shame on us. On the other hand, some may make assumptions that sure, the world will look different. Studies will be all virtual, remote monitoring will all be data-driven and remote, and that will be the future. That is not just going to automatically happen. What should the future look like after we get through this? And what should we be doing over the coming months to make sure we can realize that future? Ed, do you have thoughts on that?
Right. So I've been kind of in the technology and innovation phase for 20 years. I helped Eli Lilly set up their venture capital group back when we invested in Phase Forward that became Oracle over time. So a lot of the projections of visionaries are sometimes not anchored in the pragmatic realities that we still have to get things done right now. So I'm always encouraging do more and do big, but do what you have to do right now. And the things like, how do you seamlessly integrate a protocol plan that incorporates the option for virtual visits? And we define virtual visits as essentially a siteless interaction. You could have multiple types of a siteless interaction. That is just a common sense thing that you can do right now. This has proved that doesn't happen, but that does in fact mean that you have to take some intentional thought about, if we're getting blood drawn, they go to LabQuest or they go somewhere to go get that. So virtual interactions should be free reign. Incorporate that into your study designs. With that said, there still remains some regulatory uncertainty, like, for example, a simple question. If you can videotape and save the interaction, should you? Like, if you can save that virtual visit, I've heard different people say you should save it. Other people say you don't. I mean, you don't really video a regular site interaction. So why do you do this? But there's still some questions that need to come up about that. I've put the idea of bring your own device, Epro, into this whole mix. How do you start to do things that we've been talking about that for 12 years? This is a very common sense option that allows patients to have this, like, go ahead and do that. I'm less certain about the more longer term things that say, okay, now all of a sudden we're going to try and use EMRs as our permanent and sole source documentation for trials that enables, all these other types of monitoring. In certain disease areas it can. Oncology, probably a really good one. CNS, no, because you've got all these really complex assessments. Those are never going to be in the EMR. So it still requires your appetite and ability to innovate is going to, in fact, largely be dictated by the therapeutic area that you're studying. And so take that into account.
And some of these are implementable within existing frameworks. Switching to BYOD shouldn't mean that you needed to plan for that 2 years before your protocol went live.
That right away.
On the other hand, a smarter endpoint that can enable an entirely remote visit to take place requires quite a bit of advanced coordination and planning by a sponsor. Do you sense that sponsors will be in a position to make commitments around that, to change their, you worked at Lilly, the processes, the vendors, the owners of the clinical development plan, behaviors have to change for that to become a future norm?
The investment in, because I've been around this long enough to know, people have been talking about sensors for about 10 years and how sensors are going to vitalize the industry. You have to get the endpoint that you're looking at in your sensor to be deemed to be, yeah, that's indicative of disease progression or efficacy, that requires studies of, does it actually correlate? It's a conversation with the FDA. That is expensive work to do, especially from a technology standpoint, to get it to integrate, make sure it's all clean. And it's almost a custom development, until you get to a real commercial adoption stage where there's lots of it. A lot of vendors aren't all that interested in it. We have been hesitant to do a bunch of experimental sensor implementations just because of the uncertainties that are there. That requires a completely different, almost kind of standalone investment into, electronic endpoint development. Like 15 years ago, there was an investment in patient-reported outcomes. Like, were those going to be acceptable? And so it requires kind of a new initiative to focus on that. But that's really hard to do in the stream of, implementing your everyday activities.
Ed, quick question from online. Platforms like yours that you were describing, does that work across all therapeutic areas, or are there some therapeutic areas or types of studies where the platform that you are leading fits best right now?
I've always said that the choice of platform isn't just it fits all therapeutic areas. And oncology is very different. The vast majority, when we're talking about a platform to capture electronic source at the site, it depends on what's the prevalence of electronic source being captured specifically and only for the study versus standard medical care. And in oncology, most of that is already in the existing electronic medical record. So our particular approach for site captured e-source in an oncology study probably doesn't make as much sense because there's not that much unique versus GI, dermatology, immunology, CNS. But activities like Epro, where oncology is trying to get more Epro outcomes, that platform makes a lot of sense to merge. And then how do you get the site-based data and the patient-based data so that the oncologist can actually see what's going on? So the choice of the platform does, in fact, I believe, dictate more or less dependent on the therapeutic area. And I think a vendor doesn't tell you that is not really telling you the truth.
Cheryl, you mentioned, this summer will be an important time to look at the things that are being done differently around monitoring and look at what we can make the new normal. Does that feel like the right time frame that organizations should be thinking about? That right now we're in this acute stage of trial continuity, but by the summer, and we're documenting everything for the purposes of the study, but the summer, is that what feels like a good time for organizations to think about what should this mean for the new normal in terms of change?
I think we'll have enough leading indicator information by then, and enough dust will have cleared. So I'm gearing up for that summer time. I also think, just building on some of the conversation that we've had, is it's important to think about the perspective of the patient and the sites and what they're going to demand as the new normal. Right. We as sponsors may have one idea, but I do wonder the convenience of a factor for patients of having home care or remote visits themselves, if they become a driving force for us.
Yeah, I actually just want to throw out a mention of an article that came out this morning for Clinical Leader, for those of you who are interested. And I pulled it up, and 61% of the patients surveyed were in favor of telehealth. Yeah. And electronic diaries, 53%. I mean, these are really significant numbers. So I really think that we should use this as a springboard to move ourselves into the 21st century. One of the biggest challenges that a lot of companies have is, or have had, is what's the business case? What's the value? A lot of people who head ClinOps organizations don't understand how to sell that to their executives. But every Monday, there's about 160 CEOs on a town hall conference call who are clamoring for that now. And they really should, the heads of clinical should think about what they should do now to really start to move this forward, because the resistance is gone.
And I would add the silver lining piece to that, the demand that patients will have. I think it's also one of the areas for us to help accelerate diversity in clinical trials. It starts breaking down barriers of having to travel to sites. So, there's some, I think, real potential for upside at the other end of this.
I do too.
I certainly would agree that the opportunity, it sounds like from this conversation, certainly folks rethinking their monitoring and the boundaries that they've self-imposed around monitoring, and rethinking some of these opportunities to enable more flexibility for patients in how they participate, whether at a site or remote to the site. But to me, a lot of that barrier seems to be bounded by the endpoints we rely on. And Laura, you were mentioning that earlier with the 6-minute walk test, I think is a classic example of schlepping patients into a site just to make them walk back and forth, rather than enabling the use of whether video or other types of technology for that future. Do you see that as being another silver lining here, Lori, in terms of the endpoints people are going to be investing in?
I absolutely do. And I would say that we should all be thinking about both availability of medicine to everyone and the cost of it. Because if we thought about every single thing we're wasting money on because we've just done it the way it's always been done, and we think about how things are going to change afterwards, we should be contributing to trying to save some of the cost of developing drugs rather than adding to it. I feel really passionately about this, and I think we waste massive amounts of money and time doing things that aren't critical and we need to think differently about.
So just to build on this and this kind of final theme around meeting the needs of our patients in these research studies, whether that means access in any dimension, I think one element that'll be important is that just right now access to information. Are there any best practices or recommendations for folks in the audience around keeping our patients informed about what's going on? If there are changes happening, how do we alleviate their concerns and anxiety? How do we best keep patients aware of what they need to know right now? Any strategies from the folks in this group?
Well, I can start. I think it's important that we start by being in close communication with our investigative sites and helping prepare them with some talking points for the patients around what's happening now with COVID-19, the potential impact to them, and giving them some tools to reach out to their patients with. And I think also connecting up with patient advocacy groups where appropriate, and really working with those patient advocacy groups to get some of that messaging out there.
I'm going to take a third attempt to offend another group, but IRBs, I think the regulatory guidance said, guess what? Go ahead and communicate. Go ahead and make some changes. It's not going to end the world if you inform the IRB after the fact, and allowing sites, or in fact encouraging them to have some more transparent communications. That doesn't, every single thing that you talk to a patient about doesn't have to get approved by the IRB and so this is a chance to just have some connection with patients, as opposed to hiding behind rules and dictates that we think have to be imposed. Absolutely. Talk to your site and talk to your patient, and don't worry that the IRB is going to say you influenced them.
So in our last minute here, I know somebody had asked online about the link to the article, Lori, that you had mentioned. I put that into the group chat so folks can find that there. There was somebody who had asked about a recording of this event, which Chris has indicated will be available on the MassBio YouTube channel. So look for that there. And Lori, you had mentioned a telemedicine event. Is that
yeah, we're having and you're going to be on it, Craig, so I'll put in a plug for you contributing. We're having a telemedicine town hall with several folks who are out there actually doing it. And I guess best way to do it is to go on LinkedIn and direct message me, and I'll get you an invitation.
See you on LinkedIn, everybody. Everybody be well, stay safe, stay home, and keep doing what you're doing to keep these trials going. Thanks, everyone. Have a fabulous day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. We appreciate it. Bye, everyone.